Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video, I'll be painting this Death Korps of Krieg miniature. This is my own take on the official scheme from the heavy metal team, so it's quite likely that it's not exactly the same as the studio version. It's also my first time painting this scheme, so I'll discuss some improvements to the recipes that I found as I progress through painting the whole miniature. So without further ado, let's get started. First of all, I've primed the whole miniature using my regular Vallejo black primer via an airbrush. I've chosen to sub-assemble the miniature to make it easier to get to all of the details. However, if you are painting a few of these, you might want to assemble more of the parts. Over this primer, I've then airbrushed a solid coat of Stegadon Scale Green. This was the closest match that I could find to the colour of the jacket on the studio versions. With the trousers being a lighter shade of blue, it also seemed like a good base coat for these areas. As mentioned, this was applied via an airbrush for speed. However, Stegadon still covers pretty well by brush, so an airbrush is absolutely not necessary for any part of this scheme. Now, once that was dry, I went on to get the trousers base coated using Thunderhawk Blue. Again, this colour seemed like the most likely paint that they'd used, and I wanted to get these areas blocked out nice and early. I like to apply base coats using a larger Kolinsky Sable brush. This one in particular is a Rosemary Series 33 size 3, and this just means that I can cover the larger areas much quicker, and also get a nice smooth finish. Over the already blue areas, I found that it was easy to get a nice, smooth and opaque base coat with only a couple of thin layers. I also picked out the cuffs on the uniform using the same Thunderhawk Blue before moving on to the next stage. Following the images of the box art, I then mixed a warm bone colour of Carrick Stone into the Thunderhawk Blue. This created a colour that I felt was a much closer match, and I then layered this over the flatter areas, leaving the Thunderhawk Blue in the recesses and any shaded areas. I had some difficulty trying to match the colours exactly from the photos alone at various points in the project, as the images on the website vary so much. Often the images are completely overexposed and the colours are quite washed out when compared to the actual miniatures. So I took some inspiration from a similar recipe that I'd used before and one that can be found on the Evi archive, and this was for the Genestealer Cult miniatures. I decided that Carrick Stone was the best candidate for the job, as this would both slightly change the hue of the colour and also desaturate it. Now at this stage, I compared mine to the box art versions, and I was beginning to have some second thoughts about using Carrick Stone instead of a more saturated yellowy brown. So I did go on to add some Zandri dust into the mix, and then glaze this over the trousers in an attempt to more closely match some of the pictures that I'd seen. But to be honest, I don't really think it needed this extra step, and especially later on when the coat was more highlighted, I think Carrick Stone alone would have been fine. So feel free to completely miss this stage out. But I thought it was important to show this, and also just how difficult it can be trying to match from the images alone. Now, obviously it would be much better if Games Workshop instead released the recipes for all these schemes, and that would help to alleviate some of the frustration that us painters can face when simply trying to replicate the awesome schemes created by the studio. Once that was dry, I then went on to shade the trousers using a thinned down Dark Reaper. I noticed on the box art that the trousers are very softly shaded, so I was deliberately very minimal with this stage, carefully glazing it only into the deeper folds of the cloth. Again, when it came to the highlights, they seemed very soft on the box art version, so I tried to keep the transitions quite smooth and subtle by adding a touch of Carrick Stone into the previous mix, and then slowly building up the highlights with a thinner consistency paint. I continued with these highlights, slowly adding more Carrick stone into the mix and trying to keep the transitions as smooth as I could. I was tempted to take the contrast higher by adding in some white into the mix. However, this wasn't really how the box art looked, and I was keen to keep the lines quite soft. Now it was time to continue on with the coat. Over the base coat of Stegodon Scale Green, I applied a 50-50 shade of Stegodon and AK Black. This was thinned down to a glaze consistency and carefully applied into the folds and recesses. I try not to worry too much about tide marks at this stage, as it's just really part of the process, and I'll be going back over these glazes a couple of times to build up the shading. Keep in mind that the usual techniques of applying glazes are still important, such as the direction of the brush, so pushing the pigment into the shaded area, but also trying not to let the glaze pull too heavily. Whilst that was drying, I took a quick break to block out the boots and leather straps on the chest using some AK Black. This will help me to focus more on the jacket for the time being, and will provide a nice defining shade line separating these details later on. Now once that's done, it's often necessary to glaze back in the opposite direction using some of the Stegodon base coat. This helps to smooth out any rougher transitions and tide marks, and it also brings the colour back into those areas that have been too heavily shaded. And it's important to remember that you can go back and forth with these stages until you're completely happy. Once I was happy with the shading stage on the coat, it was time to add some highlights. To start with, for this, I added a small amount of Administratum Grey into the Stegodon. For this first stage chunky highlight, it's important to be quite subtle, so only adding a small amount of the grey in to begin with. I would say something around a 3-to-1 mix. It's also important with this first stage highlight to make it chunky enough that we can fit the subsequent stages within it. And this highlight was used around all of the edges and the folds of the coat. At this stage, I also like to switch to using a more precise brush. This one is a favourite of mine and it's a Winsor & Newton Series 7 miniature size 1, but you could really use any size brush with a sharp point and one that you're comfortable doing more precise highlights with. I also took the time to add a few little optional scratches towards the bottom of the coat. This is where it would naturally receive damage, and these would later be highlighted using the same stages as the rest of the jacket, as well as adding some glazes of a muddy colour to create some further weathering. Another thing that I often like to do with cloth is to thin down some of this first highlight mix to a glaze consistency, and then use this to smooth and soften these initial transitions. I find it can really help to make them look a little less harsh and noticeable, but it is a completely optional stage. Next, it was time for the sharper stage of highlights. I added more Administratum Grey into the previous mix. This was now around an equal parts mix, and I used this to pick out the sharper edges and folds of the coat, this time trying to be a bit more precise and fit it within the previous stage. Again, I continue to carefully pick out the scratches at the bottom of the cloak before moving on to the final highlight stages. For this, I used around a 1 part Stegodon to 2 parts Administratum mix, and this was used very selectively on the very sharpest folds of the cloth and anywhere that I thought would be catching the light. Next, it was time to paint the leather, and in an endeavour to try to more closely match the box art, I opted to use an equal parts mix of Mournfang Brown and Doomball Brown for the base coat. However, I think you could opt to just use the Doomball Brown alone for this, without too much noticeable difference. Once I had a nice solid base coat, it was time to shade the leather, and for this I simply added a small touch of black into the base coat. This was then glazed around the recesses, but on the larger flatter areas like on the backpack, I built up this glaze over several thin layers to create a soft transition towards the bottom. Once that was dry, I made a deep shade by adding some more black into the mix, and this was then applied much more controlled as a line shade into the deepest recesses, and it was also used to quickly block out any buttons and rivets. Now once that was done, I applied the first stage highlights to the leather using Mournfang Brown, and this was applied around all of the edges. Again, for this I switched to using a sharper brush, just to make it a bit easier to apply these highlights. For the next stage of highlights, I opted to use XV88. I was hoping this would look a bit closer to the box art leather, and it seemed like a likely candidate. Again, this stage is applied slightly thinner than the previous one, and around all of the edges. I also used the same highlights to create some texture on the larger panel on the backpack. I thought adding a little texture here would just help to make this large panel look a bit more interesting and also add to the feeling that this is a well-worn backpack. For the final stage of highlights on the leather, I used a roughly 2:1 mix of Karak Stone and XV88, concentrating this on the sharpest and upwards most facing edges. Now for the boot wrappings and the bedroll on the backpack, I applied a couple of thin coats of Xandri dust. This was then shaded using a thinned down Steel Legion drab. Highlights were then applied to the wrappings using ushabti bone. And for the final highlights I used Screaming Skull. I went on to paint the boots in a darker contrasting leather recipe, starting with a base coat of Rhinox hide. This was then given a wash of a thinned down AK black paint, and remember that after this is dry you can go back with the Rhinox stage and tidy this up if you need to. And for the first stage of highlights I used Dryad bark. We're going for a much more desaturated leather this time, so I added some grey into the mix to help with this. For the next sharper highlight stage, I made a roughly equal parts mix of Administratum Grey and the previous Dryad bark. Finally, I applied some very selectively placed highlights of Administratum Grey, and these were added to the sharpest corners and edges. Now it was time to paint the face mask, and this was painted with a very similar recipe to the wrappings and the bedroll, this time starting with a base coat of Carrick Stone. This was then shaded using Baneblade Brown, but you could also opt to use a thin glaze of something like Steel Legion Drab instead. Next, I made an equal parts mix of Carrick Stone and Screaming Skull, and then used this to carefully highlight the contours of the mask. A further highlight was then made with a roughly equal parts mix of the previous Screaming Skull and also AK White. Now it was time to paint the darker metallic areas that can be seen on the box art. For this dark metal, I like to make my own mix using Vallejo Model Air Silver and Black. With this mix, it's possible to fine tune exactly how dark you want it to be. However, if you do want a ready mix paint for this, then I recommend something like Citadel's Iron Hand Steel instead. Once the base coat was dry, it was time to shade this, and there's really a lot of different black contrast inks and washes that you could use for this purpose. However, this time I used some carbon black ink from Liquitex, thinning this down with water and then glazing it over the surfaces a couple of times to build up the shading. Highlights and scratches were then picked out on these metallic areas using pure Vallejo Model Air Silver. I then went on to paint the lenses on the helmet, and I first base coated them using corn red, and this was then followed by picking out the lower 2/3 of the lens using mephiston red. For the next highlight stage, I used Evil Sun Scarlet. This was then followed by AK Deep Orange, or you could also opt to use Citadel Troll Slayer Orange. A final sharp highlight was then applied towards the bottom of the lens, using a mix of Fire Dragon Bright and white. Finally, a dot of pure white was then applied into the corner of the lens. Now it was time to paint the gun casing, and for the first chunky stage highlight here I opted to use an equal parts mix of Eshin Grey and Black. You might have also noticed this rather eye-catching plasma glow effect, and don't worry, I've not skipped filming this. The footage for this is going to be used as part of a separate video on this topic. I was really pleased with how this effect came out and actually how easy it was without the need for an airbrush, so stay tuned for the video on that very soon. For the next sharper stage highlight, I made an equal parts mix of Eshin Grey and Dawnstone Grey, and again this was applied around all of the edges of the gun casing. Now I know there is quite a lot of mixes being used here for these highlights, and you might ask why mix when you could just use the out of the pot colours instead, and you could definitely do that too if you're just painting this a bit quicker for an army. However, I personally like to make mixes because I feel like they offer a softer highlight progression and aren't quite as harsh as using the out of the pot colours. But this is very much a matter of personal taste, and you should experiment to find what works best for you. And for the final stage highlights, I made an equal parts mix of Dawnstone Grey and Administratum Grey. I personally enjoy a very defined and sharp look, so I apply this stage as sharp as I can around pretty much all of the edges. However, to save some time here, you could also just use this on the upwards most facing edges and corners. Remember that if you do make any mistakes here, then you can easily go back and sharpen up the highlights using the first stage, as I had to do here. People can often find painting black quite difficult because it's much more noticeable when your highlights aren't perfectly sharp. However, it's also one of the easiest colours to fix mistakes on. I also took the time to add a few chips and scratches to the gun casing, using the previous highlight stages. Now, one of the last things to do was to paint the small gold details on the armour, and for these smaller details I like to start nice and bright, this time opting to base coat with a light bronze from Procryl. The Citadel equivalent here would be something like Liberator Gold. This was then given a quick shading using some Gore-Grunter Fur contrast paint. Highlights were then picked out with a mix of light bronze and silver. And the miniature was now complete. Thank you to everyone for supporting these videos here on Patreon. For the last couple of weeks I've been working on a very exciting Golden Demon project, which will feature as part of a series of videos after the Plasma one. So stay tuned for that, and I'll catch you in the next one.